Hark and well met, folks. Good morning and welcome back to the Sunday brunch stream. My name is RuneMeisterKris, and man, it has been a minute since we have had a good old-fashioned brunch stream here on the channel. I hope you don't mind. I've abandoned the vest today for the comfy sweater. It is a little chilly and rainy over here, so I wanted to feel a little more cozy. So since we haven't done a brunch stream in a while, I want to go over a lot of the things that we might have missed in the time frame since the last time we did one of these. Viking Archaeology is having a lot of things coming out recently. And I don't know if it's just that people are writing more articles about Viking Archaeology because the interest is peaking right now between God of War and other games like Valheim and projects such as the Northman movie and just a global interest in Viking Age Viking Age studies, right? But I'm seeing a lot and more articles and studies and stuff coming out in this year, particularly in the more recent times, about amazing new things that are going on in Scandinavian archaeology, Viking Age archaeology. And so, yeah, we're just going to go through like a little roundup of a couple of the coolest finds that are coming out of Viking Age Scandinavia within the month of November. This is just within 1 month. We have 3 major finds coming out of Scandinavia. Hooray for learning. Hey, that's what we do here on Sundays. Sundays are learning days. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning into the video. Before we get started, I'm going to have to do that mandatory subscribe plug. So if you could go ahead and hit the button, it would be greatly appreciated. Every little bit of support helps the channel grow and allows me to make more top quality content. That's what we're here for, isn't it? So subscribe. I'm probably going to be getting a haircut this week. You're going to see a new and improved Rune. I'm going to get rid of a lot of this stuff up on top. It's been a minute since I had a real haircut. Don't tell anyone, but I think I'm going to grow out the beard again to compensate. Let's look at these. Let's look at these 3 articles that I have queued up, and see what sort of crazy stuff is coming out of Scandinavia. First up, an article from Live Science, a great source. I find a lot of really awesome archaeological articles here on Live Science. Article written by Laura Gegel. Apologies if I am mispronouncing that. Right at the very start of November. 2 Viking swords buried upright might have connected the dead to Odin and Valhalla. Archaeologists in Sweden excavating a Viking grave field have uncovered 2 burials containing swords standing upright. Swords have a lot of meaning to medieval Scandinavians, right? It's more than just a weapon and a tool. There was, in a lot of recorded sagas and stories and instances, it seems like there was a personification given to these weapons where they had a spiritual attachment, right? A sword of an ancestor held more power than a fresh sword. So one that had seen battles, one that had done things. Swords earned names, that's why that's where like Lord of the Rings gets it from, naming all their weapons. That's where a lot of it, and then this wasn't just a Viking thing too. People named their weapons. And so having a sword with a name and a spirit attached to it was a big thing, And so having a sword in your burial with you meant that you were taking that power with you, and having the sword positioned in certain ways could tell you different things about both the person that was in the grave, the weapon itself, and what sort of message is being sent out there. So having swords that are standing upright in a grave sends a message, a very specific message, because it's an unconventional way to do it, right? It's also just a pretty well-preserved sword. I mean, it's got the pommel and the crossguard and the blade and everything all still intact on there. Handle's all good. Happens to just be a pretty well-preserved sword. Archaeologists in Sweden have unearthed 2 Viking swords in neighboring graves that were buried upright as if they were standing on their points. Whoever installed the iron swords perpendicular to the surface about 1,200 years ago clearly did so on purpose, as it would have taken a lot of effort, possibly involving a rock or hammer, to wedge the weapons roughly 16 inches into the ground. The placement of the swords reflects an action with a lot of symbolism. When you find swords in graves, which you don't do very often, they often lie beside the buried individual as a faithful companion on the voyage to the next world. Like I said, a lot of times swords are not really dropped into burials for the reasons of they had that power, they had that symbolism and carrying on. Also, they just had tremendous value. It was expensive to get a really nice sword. So having a sword that you would be able to pass down from one person to another, an inheritable weapon, had a lot of value to it. And often the people who were buried with their weapons were really respected individuals because they were granted that gift into the future. And there are even some crazy circumstances where people had their blades intentionally broken during the burial process, where there are a number of artifacts in museums of swords that were heated and bent around, kind of creating like a little loop through them. It's meant to kind of like break the power from the weapon, or to prevent anybody from stealing the weapon's power. There's a couple different interpretations. But it's fascinating the correlation between specifically swords and burials in the Viking Age. As can be seen here, talking about a lot of different intentions, there are multiple possibilities as to why these swords are actually being buried upright, which is obviously, like I said, something non-conventional. I don't really hear very much at all about upright buried swords. A lot of people believe that the swords served as a connection to the Norse warrior god Odin and his domain of Valhalla, where slain warriors were reportedly resided under Odin's leadership. So I guess what they're saying is like potentially the sword was meant to act as like a conduit for a bridge or something leading to Valhalla and leading to Odin. One possibility, tough to prove, but certainly an interpretation that could be made. They had this project obviously was a part of highway construction projects, as many things are. Most excavations are only really going to occur in a place where they think it's going to be a problem. You know, like these Viking burials. If they had come across this in any other circumstance, or if they didn't think that these burials were going to be directly impacted by the work that was getting done, they probably would just record what they can see, like record what they can, and then leave it. The only time that you're doing like a full, like, you know, as we say in the States, phase 3 excavation and extraction of the archaeological material is when you think that it's going to get destroyed by the project, you know? So this road construction, this highway construction project is probably going to be blasting right through this burial field. And so they're excavating and removing the remains because it's either that or it gets bulldozed, because you don't want to disturb it, right? You want to keep it preserved. And excavating and pulling it all out isn't really doing that all the time. Most of the burials within this area date to the late Iron Age, meaning just like the Proto-Norse time period, the time directly before the Viking Age. And they were made with stones forming graves up to 23 feet in diameter. The two burials bearing swords are each about 16 feet across and date to the 9th or 10th centuries AD, which is firmly during the Viking Age. However, both of those graves, as well as the third burial containing glass beads, were placed on top of an earlier grave mound that dates to the 7th or 8th centuries AD, meaning that each of these individuals was part of a multi-chronological grave monument. So yeah, what they're saying is that there was an Iron Age burial mound, a Proto-Norse burial mound, a pre-Viking Scandinavian mound, and then on top of that mound, more people were buried. So this bears the question, is that the result of intention? Like, did they put them here because they knew it was a revered space and they wanted to grant the same sort of honor to those people? Was it a result of genealogy of, this is my family's burial mound, I am going to be buried on top of them? It's a couple hundred years apart, so that's a pretty big stretch. Or is this just a situation of, people have always been buried here, we're going to bury people here, just don't go too deep because there's more people under there, you know? Is it just a matter of convenience? Regardless, there does seem to still have that level of importance levied on these individuals with having these stone settings, these swords placed into these locations. Construction of the two stone settings with swords were done deliberately, perhaps to create a connection with a certain individual, ancestor, or social group. So rather than connecting the buried individuals to Valhalla and Odin, it's possible that the swords were meant to connect them to the ancient individuals that were already residing there. As I said before, they were expensive, and it was a huge investment to bury the weapons in graves, because it made them, you know, kind of a whole thing. And that's why you actually see a lot of myths, and they did this in the Northman movie. And there's a couple other instances of it being mentioned in sagas where people will go into burial mounds to retrieve ancestral swords. Old barrows and grave mounds were a target of looting during the Viking Age, because they would go in and they would retrieve swords from famous individuals or their own family ancestors on like their own sort of quest, mainly because they were so expensive. Both of the swords recovered are about 39 inches total and are broken. That's not uncommon. A lot of museum recovered swords are broken, but they are hoping to get it back together to see as much as they can learn about it as possible. The question is, was that sword just sticking out of the ground this entire time? Because that's actually insane. Oh, here's an interesting interpretation. Some researchers suggest that sharp objects stuck into graves were a way to prevent the dead from rising. This is a trope that we actually talked about in my most recent YouTube video, which admittedly was too long ago. But it was after Halloween. We talked about spooky monsters and traditions and stuff. And yeah, the idea of like wights and Draugr from Norse myth ties a lot into like zombie and undead myths that come from other places. And we did talk about the idea of like staking people into the ground to prevent them from coming back as like zombies or vampires or other forms of undead. So the interpretation that the swords were buried as a way to prevent the dead from rising, yeah, they said, we don't think this applies to the graves as the swords were such precious objects. Instead, knives or arrowheads could have been used, which would have been significantly cheaper. Maybe so. I would say that really depends on where in the grave the swords were buried, you know? Like, is this going directly into the person's chest, or is this next to them? But yeah, regardless, there's a lot that still needs to be learned about this, about these sword burials. But it's definitely a very interesting find. Having the two very valuable swords in this burial, or in these burials, within the Viking Age, and in such an unconventional manner, could tell us a whole lot about, you know, burial practices, customs, mortuary practices. Something cool to keep an eye out for. Now, the next big discovery that happened, you know, this article was released almost immediately after. A once-in-a-lifetime discovery. Swedish archaeologists have unearthed a cache of Viking silver that still looks brand new. Now, caches of Viking silver are not the well, they're rare, right? I don't want to come across and make it sound trivial, like you find them all the time, but they're not they're not unknown in the archaeological record, right? We've had Viking caches show up in Scandinavia and in Britain. Many different finds, collections of rare objects and money and valuables that kind of show up in various different places. But I think that the intensity of this find, the reason why it's once in a lifetime, is just the sheer preservation that occurred and the quality of the information present in the artifacts that they are recovering from this. Discovered outside of Stockholm, the hoard includes a Norman coin whose only previous documentation was in an 18th century book. I think that what they mean by this is not this specific coin was mentioned in an 18th century book. I think what they mean is the type of coin that was found in there is only ever referenced in this one book, and they had no physical examples of it. Which that again, as I said, the informative nature of the artifact, that would be what it is. The team of specialists dug beneath a decayed wooden floor of a building within a Viking Age settlement, and they discovered a small ceramic pot. Inside laid 8 neck rings, 2 arm rings, a finger ring, a pair of pearls, and 12 coin pendants deposited in a linen pouch. Having a buried hoard, right? A buried collection of stuff, buried treasure, right? It's a trope that the Vikings participated in. It was that was kind of part of it. You know, they had these ceramic pots and they buried them. They had their coin hoards and they would, you know, stuff them away somewhere, squirrel them away. And then they would come back to it when times were safer or when they needed it. It's the same sort of mentality as the stuff your money under your like bed cushion type deal. This collection, obviously some great artifacts. Neck rings and arm rings were really interesting because a lot of times they served as their own type of currency. So at times when Scandinavians didn't always have actual coins, they would use like ring coins, ring money, or bar money. And basically they would have an arm ring around the arm, and you could actually bring out the arm ring and like hack a piece of metal off of it and weigh it, and you'd be like, oh, this is my silver arm ring. I have hacked off 3 ounces of this silver arm ring. You now have 3 ounces of silver, which has value, right? And then you would keep the rest of the arm ring and you would use it for later. It was like a wearable wallet. We're probably going to see them in a little bit, but whether or not these neck rings and arm rings are designed or built for monetary purposes, typically the arm rings were the ones that had money, but there were designed ones as well at some points, and the neck rings were more often decorative. The neck rings provoked particular excitement. Okay, forged in the Torque style, A symbol of wealth and status for Viking men and women, the nearly 1,000-year-old rings were extraordinarily well preserved despite having been made and deposited almost 1,000 years ago. They looked almost completely new. Open it in a new tab. Let's see if we can see some of these things. So the quality is obviously lost because I zoomed in, but I mean, yeah, that's pretty incredible that you can see the interlace, like the entwining design on these. They're obviously like, you know, they're like big metal. That's the armband right there. Yeah, so these aren't money bands. These are absolutely jewelry pieces. These are absolutely decorative jewelry pieces. And then, like I said, there are coin pendants, which means that they collected coins from abroad, turned them into necklaces. They are very impressive pieces. And I'm curious to see if they have any like close-ups on them or something. This find is part of a larger investigation taking place at the settlement that endured from 400 Common Era through the Viking Age and into the Middle Ages. That's a massive settlement, which is bonkers. They've identified more than 20 houses and buildings, dug up arrows, quernstones. Quernstones are a lot like millstones. They're like they're small objects, but they're used to like grind up materials and stuff. And then amulet rings. This discovery probably it seems like it's probably a particularly important one. Here we go. Here's some look at those coins. Oh, look at that. The designs are all still pretty well forged in there. Yeah, that's beauty. Silver hoards have significance in many different ways. They reflect that the owners were very wealthy and are proof of advanced craftsmanship. They also reflect ancient rituals and religion. The excavation also revealed more than 1,000 other artifacts. Now, granted, I mean, artifacts can range to everything from, like, ceramic sherds, but I think that the implication there is that there is a significant amount of informative artifacts that are coming out alongside this silver hoard. Because, again, with archaeology, context is everything. So it's not just, oh, we found a silver hoard. It's, we found a silver hoard in a ceramic pot beneath the floorboards of this Viking Age house, surrounded by artifacts that also date to this time period. And, like, all of those pieces of that puzzle tell us the story of what it is. It's not just this is a Viking silver hoard. It's this is a, you know, this is a hoard discovered in this place under these conditions with this stuff around it, and that tells us this wide picture, fully colored in, of everything that you need to know regarding this particular the people who were living here. The cache itself includes a 10th century coin minted in Normandy, an area in northern France which Vikings migrated to in the early 9th century, and had only been previously discovered or documented in an 18th century book of drawings. So that means that this coin was minted during a very limited time period in Normandy. Chief among the questions posed by the hall is why inhabitants would bury the most valuable possessions. We talked about this before. It's that they wanted to keep it safe during rough goes. They wanted to make sure nobody was looting it. Beautiful coin. I wish that we had a good picture of some of these neck bands. You got a finger ring there, 2 armbands, the neck bands, and then all of those coins. They kept it very safe. They did. They kept it so safe that nobody ever got it again until now. These hoards and these finds, these discoveries, are always super exciting in the field of archaeology because obviously the pretty things, right? The pretty things, the flashy things, the shiny things, the jewelry, the treasure, the loot. This is what draws interest. And when you have interest, you have resources. You know, these discoveries kind of, they draw the interest, they draw the appeal. These articles are being written, people are seeing this, and they're going like, wow, that's super cool. We talked about this last night. I talked about that Egyptology cave that a lot of people are talking about as possibly Cleopatra's. It's because they've done a really good job of kind of marketing what the cave is using the information. They're not giving misinformation, they're proposing ideas. And obviously the media tends to run with that stuff pretty intensely. But when you have these big discoveries, like hoards in the Viking Age, you have a better likelihood that people who are hearing about it are going to be interested in it. And when there is a growing interest from the public, there is a growing interest from the private sector, and then there's a growing interest in the private sector, and then these universities, these organizations, these archaeological contracting firms will have better opportunities to acquire the funds that they need in order to do the job that they're doing. And when they can do that, they can do better jobs, and they can do more excavations, and they can find more stuff, and it kind of snowballs, you know what I mean? And that's why places like Birka are able to have ongoing, some of the most intense ongoing archaeological investigations in Scandinavia. Because there's massive, you know, because there is public interest in Birka. Rightfully so. It's a cool place. I wish I could go. That's on my bucket list. Now, the last article that we have drafted up for this month, this one was from just yesterday. Archeo news from yesterday. No, wait a minute. No, I posted this article more than just yesterday. I think that, okay, yeah, the 19th of November. Yesterday is when I guess it was updated. But Archeo News has an article here talking about a cave complex with hieroglyphs and Varangian symbols discovered in the center of Ukraine. This one is very cool, also not usually within my area of expertise. I don't deal with the Rus very often. I don't deal with eastward heading Vikings and eastward heading medieval Scandinavians all that often. But this one caught my eye, just seemed like a very interesting story and definitely something very informative. So basically the situation, this one I read a little bit more about because I was going to do a TikTok on it. But basically the situation is that there's this man named Dmytro Perov who works as a conservationist in Kiev's Center for Urban Development. And he went out with a couple of buddies to try and find caves that he had heard about from family that supposedly existed behind this now abandoned house. So him and his few buddies went out and they were looking around the house and they were looking around the property, and they basically found behind one of the crumbling walls in this abandoned house were entrances to caves. And there were, I think, 4 caves or 4 cave systems, and they only went into like 1 or 2 of them initially. But it was like a week or 2 ago, they basically went out there with a team of archaeological researchers. They went and got some and came back. Smart play. And they went through and they started to discover carvings on the inside of this cave. Animal figures, kind of weird design symbols, and various different things. And in particular, they found an Algi's rune, or at least what they believe is an Algi's rune. Now, Algi's, for those of you unfamiliar, is this rune. It's this rune here. They call it the chicken foot or something. But it's basically like it's a line with a V on top, right? To create a little trident. And the Algi's rune, in some sources, said that it was used as a kind of symbol of protection for a lot of peoples. And in some cases, the Varangians. Now, the Algi's rune is an Elder Futhark rune. So people who are saying like, oh, we found a Viking cave, it's like, yes and no. I mean, the Algi's rune, used as a regular form of the runic alphabet, had ceased to happen during the Viking Age. When the Viking Age rolled around, they had moved on to the younger Futhark, which obviously was a much more streamlined shorthand version of the runic alphabet that allowed for kind of easier writing and carving. The Algi's rune is a relic of that older writing style, but it still shows up as a design and something that you can see in a lot of different places. And it's there, as I said, like I personally have varying feelings on the interpretation of runes as like spiritual or magical symbols. I have maybe less than compelling feelings towards that as being like a common use, but the assurance by the researchers here were that it was used as a symbol of protection by Varangians, which is fine. Ultimately, it's a Z rune, so it means the letter Z in Elder Futhark, or the sound of that, you know. So that's kind of like what the Algi's rune is literally. And just as a quick recap for those of you who don't know or don't remember, Varangians were a particular type of Viking. A particular type of person from the Rus culture who would travel and kind of sell they acted as like sellswords. So a lot of the Varangians went south to Byzantium and worked for the Byzantine emperors and things like that. There was just kind of like a different brand, like an Eastern Viking, which ties in because, as I said, this complex is thought to date from the Kievan Rus time period. Now, the Kievan Rus were a culture that kind of it was alongside traditional Viking Age Scandinavia. It's a difficult culture to interpret, right? Because it's kind of comprised of a couple of different cultures. There's Norse, there's Finnish, there's like other Eastern European groups that all were tied within the broad Rus banner. Oh God, I said broad Rus banner, and now I'm just thinking Bruce Banner, and why I did not mean it like that. they basically had this this weird culture weird culture that consisted of a couple of different parts that kind of blended together to create this one unified, well, semi-unified people. The caves themselves were believed to have dated from before the Viking Age, which admittedly I'm fine with in terms of talking about this Algi's rune, because if they believe that the caves began before the Viking Age and the Algi's rune is in there, then that ties in as far as I'm concerned, because the Algi's was a pre-Viking Age convention. And then it would have come about later that the Viking Age artifacts came in, because there were stuff from the like comparable to Viking Age time period, and it was likely found in the form of like ceramics and pottery fragments and other sorts of artifacts, which they are kind of vague on right now, obviously, because this is a developing thing and they haven't written a formal investigative report on it yet. They haven't released information to the public, which is their prerogative. They want to make sure that they have the details right before they start coming out and spouting stuff. But they do have these inscribed symbols, these inscribed markings, these designs, animals, people, yada yada. Everything kind of like drawn in here. Animals, graffiti. Here's them discussing the Algi's on the wall. They said that the earliest that some of these symbols date back to was the 5th or 6th centuries BC. That is to say, a tremendously long time ago. And definitely pre-Viking Age. So obviously, like we were saying, this was a tremendously long time ago. 5th and 6th centuries BC, obviously a couple hundred years before the Viking Age. Almost 1,000 years before the Viking Age. Viking Age started in the 8th century AD. So over 1,000 years. And so finding these, obviously the Algi's rune wouldn't have been from there too. What this is telling us is that this is a cave that was used across multiple contexts, right? These were caves that had significant prehistoric implications, and obviously sites that have that level of importance in localities are remembered and they are known about, and so people will continue returning to them. So seeing artifacts and carvings and evidence that dates from, you know, a couple hundred BC all the way up to the Viking Age shows that this cave had a significant level of importance to the Rus, the Varangians, the pre-Rus, pre-Varangian cultures, and their Viking Age compatible cousins. There we go. Yeah, the Kievan Rus state was made up of East Slavic, Norse, and Finnic peoples. And as such, it is tough to go, if you're going to try to subdivide the Kievan Rus into those three cultures, it's hard to say which one particularly left these carvings or whether or not it was left by multiple people. I mean, over the course of that many hundreds of years, over 1,000 years, it's possible it could have been people from all three who went through there at various times, occupied the space and utilized it. Definitely interested to see on how this story develops and what sort of things we see coming out of this discovery, assuming that they're able to conduct their research safely and continuously. So yeah, guys, those are the 3 articles that I have drafted up for this week. I think it was I think that was a good time. Thank you guys for coming along on this little Viking roundup for the month. I don't really do news roundups all that often. If that's something that you guys like if you liked this, if you thought that that's an interesting thing for us to do, like, I'd be down to do that, assuming that the fines keep up with it.